The briefing said, non-threatening civilian presence encouraged. It did not say what counted as civilian. It did not say what counted as non-threatening. I had not slept in 30 hours. I had Barley's leash in one hand and a half-eaten protein bar in the other, and by the time I understood what the briefing actually meant, I was already inside the assessment hall, and the Vethrak-Suun delegation was already walking through the far door. I would like to say I made a decision. I did not. I stood there, protein bar in hand, while Barley walked to the center of the hall, turned twice in a slow circle the way he always did, and lay down. That is where this story starts. The rest is administrative. The Compact had been trying to open a permanent negotiating channel with the Vethrak-Suun for 4 years. Was approximately how long the Vethrak-Suun had been methodically absorbing and neutralizing everything the Compact fielded against them. 11 campaigns, not 11 engagements, 11 formal campaigns, each one beginning with a joint strategic review and a plan and a line in the combined logistics log that said the previous campaign's lessons had been incorporated. 11 campaigns, 11 absorbed lessons. The Vethrak-Suun did not win by force. They won by learning. You sent a cavalry formation, and they cataloged it. And the next time you sent a cavalry formation, there was a counter-formation waiting with specific equipment tuned to that specific approach. You sent a suppression barrier, and they identified the gap frequency, and they wrote a tool, and the tool was in use across their entire front line. Inside of a week, you sent specialists. They cataloged the specialists. You sent the specialists countermeasures. They cataloged those. Intelligence section had a running-off file called the Absorption Index. Every weapon system, every tactical doctrine, every trained unit class, the Compact had deployed and had subsequently watched become inert against Vethrak-Suun defensive architecture. The index was extensive. Instructor Vethmaran, who ran the strategic analysis seminar I'd sat through 6 weeks earlier, put it on the display screen and made us look at it in silence for 90 seconds before saying, "They don't beat us. They wait for us to teach them how to beat us. Then they do." He had paused and then said, "Which means the only variable they cannot absorb is a variable they haven't seen. They cannot counter something they haven't classified. Every time we send them something we have sent before, in any configuration they recognize, they build the counter. The strategic problem is not force. The strategic problem is novelty." Nobody in that seminar had said, "What about dogs?" The file did not include mastiffs. I was at Vethrak Station because I was 22 years old, and I had been assigned to second-year general posting 4 months ago, and I was the lowest-ranking cadet currently stationed on the access corridor to Assessment Hall 7, which meant I was available, which meant when Station Command sent down a request for warm body escort personnel to stand at the margins of a diplomatic observation session, and, calm and non-threatening, my name came up. There were 8 of us, 7 cadets from various postings, and a third year named Oren Falk, who had been told to organize us, which he was doing with the focused expression of a man who had no idea what was happening, but was absolutely not going to say so. "The delegate is Vethrak-Suun," Falk said, looking at his data tile. "Apex-caste. Vethrak-Suun have a hierarchical display system. He'll enter first, establish position, and the rest of the delegation reads the room based on how we respond. Station commander's guidance is, stand near the walls, do not make sudden movements, do not speak unless spoken to, project calm. The idea is to show them a room of unbothered humans so they get a baseline read on what our non-hostile posture looks like." "Does apex-caste mean exactly?" asked the cadet on my left, whose name I never caught. "It means he's personally overseen the neutralization of 3 combined arms formations," Falk said, still looking at the tile. "He's essentially their lead analyst. He walks in, he reads every variable in the room, he reports back to their strategic board. We're a data point. Why does the Compact want us to be the data point?" Falk set the tile down. "Because every previous data point we've given them has been something they could absorb and counter. The theory, apparently, is that what they haven't cataloged is us being boring. Our negotiating team wants to show them something they don't have a file for." There was a short silence. "What haven't they cataloged?" the cadet asked. Nobody answered that. We dispersed along the walls. I found a position near the left rear, and Barley came with me and settled onto the floor and put his chin on my boot. He did in every room we waited in. He was 8 years old, and he weighed 72 kilograms, and he had the broad, low head of his breed and a coat color of dried river clay. And when he lay down, he looked less like a dog and more like a piece of furniture that had decided, on its own terms, to stop being in use. The station floor was warm. He was asleep inside of 90 seconds. I had had him since he was 10 weeks old. My father bred working mastiffs on a farm in the hill country outside Merrick Station, the same Merrick Station the diplomatic corps came from, incidentally. And when I'd been accepted to Vethrak Academy, my father had said, "Take the dog," in a tone that made it clear this was not a suggestion. The reasoning was, a young woman alone on a deep station posting with a 70-kilo mastiff beside her was less alone than she looked. He was not wrong. I had spent 4 months at Vethrak and nobody had bothered me once, and I had always assumed this was because of my naturally authoritative bearing, which is a polite way of saying I looked like I was thinking about something more important than you were. Practical reality of living with a mastiff on a deep station posting was that every room felt slightly smaller and every corridor felt slightly more occupied, and the station's smaller species. The Veleth class exchange students, with their narrow frames and their tendency to startle, gave a wide berth in the common areas, which I had also attributed to my naturally authoritative bearing, until Falk told me, 4 weeks in, 3 of the Veleth exchange students had filed a formal note with the station biology office, asking whether Earth Mastiffs were classified as working animals or companion animals, because the distinction mattered for corridor clearance and protocols. The biology office had said, companion animal. The Veleth students had accepted this and continued to give us a wide berth. I know now it was Barley. At the time, I was standing against the wall of Assessment Hall 7 with my hands behind my back, looking calm and non-threatening, because those were the instructions and I was 22. And following instructions was a reflex I hadn't yet learned to modulate. The Vethrak-Suun came through the far doors at precisely the scheduled time. I had read the briefing materials. I had seen the imagery. I was not, I told myself, going to have a reaction. The reaction I had was very still, very quiet, and involuntary. The Vethrak-Suun are large. That is the first thing. The briefing materials say approximately 2 meters at the shoulder equivalent, and they do not communicate what 2 meters of something that moves like that means in a room you are also standing in. Vethrak-Suun came through first, which the briefing had said he would, and his species ambulation is not walking in the way a human walks. It is a forward-weighted, low-slung progression that keeps the center of mass extremely close to the ground and makes the whole organism read as perpetually mid-crouch even when it is technically at rest. He was dark-plated along the dorsal line and lighter along the ventral, and the plates articulated when he moved with a sound like cards shuffling, and he had 4 upper limbs in addition to the primary locomotive pair. And the upper limbs were positioned in a spread formation that intelligence called apex display posture in the briefing materials, and which in person meant, I am showing you how much of this room I can reach without moving my feet. He cleared the doorway, stopped, and read the room. I have been in rooms with people who do that, the kind of person who walks into a space and immediately knows where every exit is, who has rank, where the threat is. Vethrak-Suun did that to the entire assessment hall in approximately 4 seconds. I watched his visual cluster, the 4 forward-facing sensory nodes along his upper facial ridge, track across each wall, each standing cadet, the lighting rigs, the ceiling clearance, the floor. And then, because Barley was in the center of the floor, and Barley was the largest warm object, between the door and the far wall, Barley. Vethrak-Suun stopped tracking. The rest of the delegation filed in behind him. There were 7 of them, plus Vethrak-Suun. They fanned out as they entered in a formation the briefing had described as social hierarchy spacing. The higher the caste, the more floor space between them and the nearest body. Vethrak-Suun had the most floor space. He always would in any room he entered, presumably, because he was the one who had nullified 3 combined arms formations, and in Vethrak-Suun hierarchy that earned you room. He was still looking at Barley. Barley had not moved. His ribs rose and fell. His jowls, which were extensive, pushed slightly flat against the floor by the angle of his chin on my boot. and one ear had flopped forward in a way that exposed the inside of the ear canal to the ceiling. He looked profoundly uninvested in everything happening above him. Station Commander Jessic Bren was standing near the front of the hall with two members of the diplomatic team, and she stepped forward and gave the formal greeting in the Vethrak-Suun primary contact language, which the briefing said was a tonal system, built around pressure wave intervals, and the translation unit at her collar rendered it, and Vethrak-Suun pulled his visual clusters away from Barley and toward her, and gave the acknowledging response, which sounded like someone pressing a hand flat against a drumskin. The diplomatic team began the planned first contact portion of the session. I watched. Falk watched. The other 6 cadets watched. Vethrak-Suun participated in the diplomatic exchange for approximately 3 minutes, which was the planned introductory segment, and then he looked at Barley again. Barley had moved since the last time. He had shifted his chin from my boot to the floor itself, which gave him approximately 2 extra centimeters of neck extension, and his breathing had deepened. He was more asleep than he had been 4 minutes ago. Vethrak-Suun said something. The translation unit on Station Commander Jessic Bren's collar rendered it as, identify the floor organism. Jessic Bren, to her very significant credit, did not pause, said, that is Barley. He belongs to Cadet Voss, she gestured at me. He is an Earth domestic companion animal, a Mastiff. The translation unit did its work. Vethrak-Suun said something longer. Translation unit said, clarify, companion organism to a cadet class unit, not a deployed asset. That is correct, Jessic Bren said. Cadet Voss is assigned to escort duty. She brought her pet. Another exchange through the translation unit. Clarify. The floor organism is present in this space incidentally. Yes, Jessic Bren said. Vethrak-Suun looked at Barley for another 4 seconds. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at Barley. Barley's ear twitched. Understood, Vethrak-Suun said through the translation unit, and he went back to the diplomatic exchange. I let out a breath. I had not realized I was holding and fixed my eyes on the middle distance and tried to project calm and non-threatening presence, which was easier said than done when a 2-meter organism with 4 upper limbs in apex display posture had just catalogued me. That should have been the end of the notable part. The session would run its 40 minutes, deuce its measured non-outcome. Both sides understood that this first contact was purely observational, purely a temperature read. Nothing was being agreed and nothing was being refused. And then the delegation would leave, and I would take Barley back to quarters and sleep for 10 hours. That was not what happened. At the 12-minute mark, the Vethrak-Suun cultural liaison, a lowercase member of the delegation whose function was apparently to flag items of interest to Vethrak-Suun during proceedings, said something in a low register. The translation unit caught it as, the floor organism has not responded to entry stimulus. Entry stimulus. I had not thought about what that phrase meant until I was in the debrief 3 days later, and someone explained. When Vethrak-Suun entered a room in apex display posture, every organism in that room with any instinct for self-preservation responded to it, back, changed its posture, oriented toward the source. Humans did it. The cadets along the walls had all gone still and careful in the first 30 seconds. The diplomatic team had done it. The station commander had done it, in the controlled and professional way of someone who had trained for this specific response and was managing it rather than suppressing it. Barley had not done it. Barley had been asleep before Vethrak-Suun entered the room, and he was asleep after, and the interval had contained Barley, no information worth waking up for. Vethrak-Suun had noticed was 12 minutes in. The cultural liaison said something else, and the translation unit said, Category query, Earth Mastiff. Known biological classification. Hollis from the diplomatic team fielded this. Companion fauna, large breed domestic dog. We can provide full biological classification if the delegation requests it. Entry stimulus non-response noted, the liaison said, through the translation unit. Clarification requested. Is the organism medicated or sedated for transport purposes? He's not medicated, I said, because Jessic Bren had glanced at me, and I was the one who knew. He's 8 years old, he does that. The translation unit processed this. The liaison said something that the translation unit rendered as a category flag phrase I didn't recognize. The phrase was transmitted to the Vethrak-Suun cultural liaison's own data tile, which I watched him note. Vethrak-Suun had not looked away from Barley during this exchange. He was running his classification process. I could not read the output, but I could see the process. The systematic tracking of the visual cluster, slight adjustments in the upper limb configuration as variables were weighed. He was being very methodical about this. I had the slightly uncomfortable feeling of being in a room where someone was doing long division in their head, and the answer was going to matter. The session continued. At the 15-minute mark, the cultural liaison sent a message through the delegation's internal communication system. I could not read what it said. 4 minutes later, the door to the assessment hall opened briefly, and a station officer I did not recognize leaned in, scanned the room, located Barley, and left. The door closed. 2 minutes after that, Falk appeared at my elbow. "Station xenobiology officer," he murmured very quietly. "They've asked her to observe and provide classification support." The delegation's secondary analyst flagged Barley as an unclassified biological presence and requested a species assessment. I looked at him. "It's a standard diplomatic protocol," Falk said, in the tone of someone who has just read this in a protocol document and is not entirely sure it applies here. "Any organism present in a formal diplomatic session that is not included in the pre-session biological manifest can be assessed on quest. The delegation has a right to ask." "He's a dog," I said. "He is," Falk said. "But he's also an unclassified biological presence because he wasn't on the manifest. Because you weren't supposed to have him here. And now the delegation's secondary analyst has flagged him, and the xenobiology officer is going to have to provide a formal species assessment. What does that mean, practically?" Falk thought about this. "She's going to stand near him for a while and document what she sees." This was, in fact, what happened. The xenobiology officer, a compact woman in her 40s named Ren Kasath, I found from the formal record later, entered the hall at the 18-minute mark, moving along the wall without disrupting the diplomatic exchange, and took up a position approximately 3 meters from Barley with a documentation tile and what I recognized as a standard biological assessment kit. She was very quiet and very professional about it. Barley did not react to her arrival. Kasath noted something on her tile. Then she noted something else. She crouched down to approximate Barley's eye level, which, at his current state of horizontal deployment, was not very high, and documented the resting posture, the respiratory rate, visible because his whole barrel chest moved with it. And then she looked at the mass, which was considerable. And then she looked at the head, which was also considerable, and she made another note. The Vethrak-Suun secondary analyst, watching all of this, said something to the cultural liaison. The translation unit caught fragments. Classification comparison, biological grade, lineage indices. Kasath heard this. She looked at the secondary analyst directly, a calm, level look, and then looked back at Barley and kept documenting. Vethrak-Suun had been watching Kasath's assessment. He said, "What is your classification of the organism?" It was addressed at Kasath. She straightened up and gave him the same level look she had given the secondary analyst. "English Mastiff," she said. "Canis lupus familiaris, king breed lineage, large-scale domestic subspecies. Full biological grade documentation is in the compact xenobiology database. Cross-reference to Earth fauna classification under Biome Density Index Class 7. She looked at her tile. "He's also overdue for a joint assessment given his age. But that's not relevant to your question." The translation unit processed this. "Biome Density Index Class 7, Vethrak-Suun said. "That's the Earth classification bracket, yes. Gravity-dense biome. Apex fauna. He's a pet," Kasath said, with the even tone of someone who is not going to argue a taxonomy and is also not going to pretend it says something it doesn't say. "He's also from Earth." Both of those things are true simultaneously. Vethrak-Suun was quiet. Kasath picked up the assessment kit and walked back along the wall to the door. Before she left, she looked at me and said quietly, "He needs the joint assessment. Get him to the medical bay this week." And she left, I said. "Yes, ma'am," to the closing door. The 18-minute mark, Barley's tail moved. The slow single sweep, not a full wag, just the one-beat tracking response that meant something in his vicinity, had made a sound, His dreaming brain thought was worth acknowledging. It hit the floor and lay still. 3 members of the delegation, I noticed, had adjusted their position. Not much. 3 or 4 centimeters. Their spacing had changed. Vethrak-Suun had not moved. The cultural liaison made another note on his tile. At the 22-minute mark, Jessic Bren introduced the compact's formal statement on the current state of the negotiating offer, which was a prepared document that Hollis had spent significant effort on, and which outlined the compact's position in terms that were intended to be clear and non-provocative and amenable to productive discussion. Vethrak-Suun listened to the full statement. He asked 3 clarifying questions, which Hollis answered. He gave a response that outlined the Vethrak-Suun's established position, which was that the compact's offer was structurally unchanged from the first 3 campaign cycles, and that accepting it would require the Vethrak-Suun to dismantle counter-architectures that had been built at significant resource cost, and that had, to date, proven completely effective. This was the stall that had been running for 4 years. It was well documented. Every diplomatic approach had hit the same point and stopped there. At the 30-minute mark, Barley stood up. This took a moment because mastiffs rising from sleep operate in stages. The haunches first, then a pause to confirm the decision, then the 4 quarters, then the full extension into standing with the low rolling shake that travels from neck to tail and redistributes everything back into its correct positions. It is not fast, it is not graceful, it is thorough. When Barley was done standing, he was standing, and he turned and walked, at his own pace, across the center of the assessment hall floor toward the far wall where the water station was. The Vethrak-Suun delegation went quiet, a diplomatic pause, not a natural break in the exchange. Every one of them, all 7, and Vethrak-Suun, stopped producing language and watched Barley walk to the water station and drink from the lower bowl I'd had at station tech place, there before the session. The sound of a mastiff drinking water is objectively one of the less dignified sounds in the galaxy. There is a great deal of tongue. There is a great deal of displacement. Droplets migrate across a significant radius. Barley drank for approximately 30 seconds, lifted his head, shook it once so the remaining water resettled, and then turned around and walked back across the hall. He did not go back to my position. He went instead to approximately the center of the hall, turned his circle, and lay down again in a slightly different orientation. The Vethrak-Suun delegation remained quiet for 4 additional seconds. Then Vethrak-Suun said something that the translation unit rendered as, "The organism chose a new rest position." "Yes," Jessic Bren said carefully, prompted. "He does that," I said, because I was not good at staying quiet, and then I remembered where I was and added, "Sir, even though that honorific was not applicable to the Vethrak-Suun caste system, which operated on a completely different set of terms, it felt like the right general direction." Vethrak-Suun looked at me directly for the first time since the initial read of the room. His visual cluster tracked across me. Face, posture, hands, the leash I was still technically holding, even though it was slack, and Barley was 10 feet away and clearly not requiring it. And then back to Barley. "You maintain the organism," he said, through the translation unit. "He's my dog," I said. "Yes. Dog," the translation unit said, and then added a tonal phrase I didn't recognize, which I later found out was the unit approximating a category flag, essentially flagging dog as a term requiring further classification in the Vethrak-Suun lexicon. "Earth domestic companion animal," Jessic Bren said smoothly. "Specifically a mastiff, a large breed. They've been domesticated for several years. This one is 8 years old. His name is Barley." The translation unit processed this. Vethrak-Suun was quiet for a moment, then he said, 8 years is an adult cycle for this organism class." "Yes," Jessic Bren said, "a mastiff," Vethrak-Suun said. "Earth organism, domesticated, yes. From the Deathworld." The phrase landed in the room with a very specific weight. I had heard it before. Every cadet had. It was part of the standard xenocultural orientation in the first year. But I had always heard it as a technical classification, a shorthand for Earth's particular position in the biological gradient scale. Deathworld. High gravity, high oxygen, saturated biome, apex fauna density off the charts. The kind of planet that most spacefaring civilizations, when they model the expected output, Calculate should not produce a species that builds things. Should produce something that fights, that adapts, that kills quickly and efficiently and does not slow down. The kind of planet that produces what the Vethrak-Suun, according to intelligence reports, called the gravity-dense biome cluster. Planets where the organisms are, across the board, more than you expect. Vethrak-Suun said it the way you say something. When you have just noticed that a fact you have been working around for 11 campaigns is sitting in the center of the floor in front of you, quietly redistributing its weight. Yes, Bren said. For the third time in 2 minutes, it was impressive composure. Vethrak-Suun looked at Barley. Barley's tail moved once, not the full wag, just the single sweep that meant he was tracking something in his sleep. It landed back on the floor with a soft thump. He is not a deployed asset, Koss said. He is not a trained combat organism. He is a companion animal belonging to a cadet class unit. That's correct, Bren said. And he is from the Deathworld. Yes. The Vethrak-Suun cultural liaison said something quietly to the secondary analyst beside him, a mid-caste member, whose function I hadn't fully parsed from the briefing. The translation unit was close enough to catch it. Classification query, Earth companion fauna, biological grade against compact apex-class documentation. The secondary analyst tapped at his tile. What came back, I was told later, was that the biological grade file for Earth domestic dogs. If you pulled the raw output, muscle density indices, the bite force measurements, the ancestral lineage documentation back to the Canis lupus baseline, sensory system specifications, sat in the Compact's own xenobiology database at a level that, cross-referenced against the Vethrak-Suun's own apex fauna classification architecture, flagged as high-density biome output, lineage subspecies, unclassified combat potential. Unclassified because nobody had ever thought to classify it, because they were dogs. The secondary analyst relayed this to the cultural liaison. The cultural liaison relayed it to Vethrak-Suun in a murmur the translation unit mostly caught and mostly rendered. Vethrak-Suun looked at Barley for a long moment without speaking. How many of these organisms exist, he said, in a given human population center? It was not phrased as a question. In the Vethrak-Suun tonal system, I later learned, that phrase shape was a request for classification data. Not asking if you knew, but stating that you would now provide the answer. Bren looked at the diplomatic team coordinator, a woman named Sareth Hollis, who had been in diplomatic service for 20 years, and who had the specific expression of someone recalculating several things simultaneously. Hollis gave a slight nod. Earth has approximately 900 million domestic dogs, Bren said, across its current registered population. Mastiffs specifically number in the several millions. The total dog population across compact human stations and colonies is estimated in the several. The translation unit processed this. Then it was quiet for quite a long time. Billions, Vethrak-Suun said. Yes. Deathworld organisms. Domestic companion animals, Bren said. Pets. Pets, Vethrak-Suun said. Translation unit produced the category flag sound again. Animals humans keep for companionship, Bren said. They live in our homes. They travel with us. They're part of our daily routine. I watched Vethrak-Suun process this. His visual cluster was fixed on Barley. Not on Bren, not on the diplomatic team, not on me. On Barley, who was asleep on the floor of a formal diplomatic assessment session with a pool of water droplets migrating slowly toward the nearest floor drain. Show me the catalog, Vethrak-Suun said. Hollis stepped forward and produced a data tile. She brought up the standard compact zoological classification for Earth companion fauna and handed, without comment, to the Vethrak-Suun cultural liaison, who accepted it with 2 of his secondary upper limbs and transferred it to Vethrak-Suun. Vethrak-Suun read it. The diplomatic session had run 45 minutes at this point, which was 5 minutes over the planned duration, and nobody had said anything about stopping. He read for a while. The delegation waited. We waited. Barley slept. The secondary analyst said something to the cultural liaison. Quiet enough that the translation unit got only pieces. Biological grade, lineage, mass density classification, population saturation. The cultural liaison made a note. The cultural liaison made another note. The cultural liaison's tile, I could see from where I stood, was filling up. The Absorption Index does not contain an entry for Earth companion fauna, Vethrak-Suun said, without looking up from the tile. No, Hollis said. Doesn't. Because they were not classified as deployed assets. Correct. Because they are not deployed assets. Correct. They are personal effects. We think of them as family members, Hollis said, and she said it the way you say something that is genuinely true and also, in context, extremely pointed. Vethrak-Suun set the data tile down. He looked at Barley. He looked at me. He looked at Barley again. Cadet Voss, he said. I kept my voice steady. Yes. You brought this organism here today to this session. I did. Why? I had nowhere else to leave him, I said. Station, pet holding facility, was at capacity. The session briefing said, non-threatening civilian presence was encouraged. He's 8 years old and he doesn't do much beyond sleep. I figured he'd be fine against the wall. The translation unit did its work. Vethrak-Suun was quiet. He did not stay against the wall, Vethrak-Suun said. No, I said. He doesn't take direction well when he's decided something, to be honest with you. There was a sound from the delegation. Not from Vethrak-Suun. From the third case members along the right wall. I later found out this was approximately what a suppressed reaction sounds like in the Vethrak-Suun tonal register. It was not a laugh, exactly. It was the acknowledgement that something unexpected had occurred. Vethrak-Suun did not react to this. He was still looking at me. Or past me. At the wall behind me or at some internal calculation I couldn't follow. Then, before he returned to Barley, the cultural liaison spoke. He addressed Jessic Bren, and the translation unit caught it as protocol request. The biological presence in the center of the floor is unclassified and has demonstrated an entry stimulus non-response that falls outside established diplomatic contact parameters. We request that it be relocated to a peripheral position for the duration of the session. The room went quiet. Jessic Bren looked at me. I looked at Barley. Barley was asleep in the center of the floor. I can try, I said. He doesn't always cooperate. I walked to the center of the floor. I crouched down beside Barley and took his collar and said quietly, "Come on, bud. Let's move." Barley opened one eye. He looked at me. He looked at the general direction of the delegation. He did the particular slow blink that meant he had registered a request and was evaluating whether it warranted action. Then he closed his eye. I waited a moment. "Barley," I said, "move." He did not move. I stood up and looked at Jessic Bren. "He's decided," I said. The translation unit processed this. The cultural liaison said something, and the unit rendered it as, "The organism declined to relocate." "Yes," I said. Another pause. "At the instruction of its keeper." I told him to move, I said. He made his own assessment. The cultural liaison conferred with Vethrak-Suun. Vethrak-Suun said something short. The translation unit said, "Acknowledged." And that was the end of the reclassification attempt. Barley, as if he had decided this was the appropriate moment, opened his eyes. He didn't move otherwise. He didn't raise his head. He just opened his eyes, which were the amber brown of old wood, and looked in the direction of Vethrak-Suun with the low, unhurried gaze of an organism that does not find anything in its immediate environment particularly urgent. The two of them looked at each other. I know how this sounds. I know that attributing significance to a dog looking at something is the kind of thing people do when they are pattern matching across insufficient data. I was there. I saw it. I am telling you what I observed. Vethrak-Suun went still. Not the stillness of the apex display posture. That was a kinetic stillness. A coiled readiness that made the room feel occupied. This was something else. This was the stillness of an organism that has just registered something in its environment as belonging to a different category than the one it had been filed under, and is revising accordingly. It lasted approximately 6 seconds. Then Barley closed his eyes again. Vethrak-Suun took one step back, not a retreat, not a recoiling. One measured, deliberate step, placing approximately 30 additional centimeters between himself and the center of the room. His upper limbs came in from the spread formation. Slowly, the plates articulating softly, and settled into a configuration I hadn't seen before. Not apex display posture, something lower, something that pulled in toward the body's center line. I looked at Hollis. She was looking at the Vethrak-Suun cultural liaison with the expression of someone who wants very badly to ask a clarifying question, but knows that this is not the moment. The cultural liaison's visual cluster was fixed on Vethrak-Suun. The entire delegation had shifted. The spacing between them had changed, and the direction of the shift was consistent. Each of them, by a margin of centimeters, had oriented very slightly toward the walls, rather than the center. Not a retreat, not a recoiling from Barley specifically. Something more like the automatic readjustment that happens when the highest-ranked entity in a room acknowledges that there is a higher rank present, and the room reconfigures around the new information. Vethrak-Suun was looking at the floor, not at Barley. At the floor, somewhere between himself and Barley. The way you look at a space between two things when you're measuring it. Nobody spoke. The cultural liaison made a note on his tile. He made another note. He was documenting what he'd just observed, methodically, the way his delegation documented everything. Because that was how you built a counter-architecture, from documentation, from classification, and the classification of what Barley had just done to Vethrak-Suun's apex display posture was going to be a complicated entry. I thought later about what that entry would say. Organism class, Earth domestic companion fauna, large breed, response to apex display stimulus, none. Observer response to organism non-response, full posture recalibration, category, unknown, counter-architecture, pending, because you cannot build a counter-architecture for something that is not doing anything. You cannot absorb a lesson from something that has not presented a lesson. Barley had not threatened Vethrak-Suun. Barley had not displayed. Barley had looked at him the way. Barley looked at everything, with the calm and faintly interested gaze of an organism that has been alive for 8 years on a planet that would have killed most things in the first 8 months, and which has, as a result, a very calibrated sense of what is actually worth worrying about. Vethrak-Suun was not on that list, not out of ignorance. That was the part I think Vethrak-Suun understood in those 6 seconds, and the part that had produced the step back. Barley had looked at him, had registered him, had found him at the level where those decisions are made to be something that did not require a response. Commander Yesik Bren, Vethrak-Suun said. Yes, she said. I would like to revisit the second item on the formal agenda. Hollis, her very great credit, produced the agenda tile and said, the standing offer for a permanent negotiating channel. Yes, Vethrak-Suun said. The compact's position changed, Yesik Bren said. We've maintained the offer for. I know how long the offer has stood, Vethrak-Suun said. I have reviewed its terms 11 times, once per campaign cycle. A pause, long enough that the translation unit processed the tonal gap and flagged it as deliberate rather than mechanical. I would like to discuss acceptance. The room was quiet. Acceptance was not on the agenda. Acceptance had not been on any agenda for 4 years. Shh. Hollis looked at Yesik Bren. Yesik Bren looked at the diplomatic team coordinator on her other side, a man named Orvith Das, who had been in the room for the entire session and who had not said a single word and who now quietly opened a second data tile and began documenting. We can discuss that, Yesik Bren said. I would also like, Vethrak-Suun said, a classification summary for Earth companion fauna, all species currently present in compact population centers, full taxonomy. We can provide that, including population densities by station and colony. Yes, Vethrak-Suun looked at Barley one more time, and I would like it noted in the formal record of this session that the reconsideration was prompted in part by the organism Barley, Earth Mastiff, companion animal to Cadet Second Class Voss Vethrak Station. There was a moment. In part, Hollis said carefully. In part, Vethrak-Suun confirmed. Orvith Das, without looking up from his documentation tile, made a note. The session ran another 2 hours. This was unexpected. Hollis and her team had prepared for 40 minutes, and they had prepared well, but they had prepared for 40 minutes. And a 2-hour pivot into substantive channel negotiation required a degree of improvisation that I observed from the back wall with considerable respect. Yesik Bren did not stumble once. Hollis did not stumble once. Das documented everything. The first 40 minutes of the extension covered the structural terms of the proposed channel. What a permanent negotiating table would look like, who would hold seats, what categories of issue would be in scope. This was ground the Compact's team had prepared for, even if not for today specifically, and they handled it with the calm of people who had been rehearsing this conversation for 4 years. The Vethrak-Suun asked about Earth companion fauna 3 more times during those 40 minutes. Once about the geographic range of the Mastiff across Earth's historical territory. Once about the relationship between working breed lineages and the companion classification taxonomy. Whether working animals and companion animals were the same category or adjacent categories. Once about the expected behavioral response of an adult Mastiff when its human owner was threatened. Hollis answered each question without hesitation. The third one she answered as, the behavioral response would be proportionate and immediate. Dogs have co-evolved with humans for approximately 15,000 years. The bond is functional. If Cadet Voss were threatened, Barley would respond. How, Vethrak-Suun said. Effectively, Hollis said. The translation unit processed this. The Vethrak-Suun, secondary analyst, made a long note on his tile. The second 40 minutes of the extension moved into the substantive question of what mutual de-escalation would require. This was the hard part. The part that had been the hard part for 4 years. The part where 11 campaigns of absorbed lessons sat on one side of the table, and the compact's depleted strategic patience sat on the other. Vethrak-Suun was precise and difficult and thorough, and the compact's team matched him for all three, and the room moved in the direction of a thing that could be built on. I watched all of this from the back wall and I thought, he's still doing it. He's still cataloging. But the frame has shifted. Before Barley, the frame was, what can the compact deploy and how do we counter it? Now there was a second question running in parallel. A question that did not have an entry in the absorption index and was not going to get one in any tidy form because the question was not about deployment. The question was about what else Earth had brought with it, in the carrying cases and the leashes and the kibble bowls, that the galaxy had looked at and thought, that's just a pet. I did not say this out loud. I was 22, and I was standing against a wall, and my job was to look calm and non-threatening, and I was doing that job. But I thought about it. Barley slept for 90 of those 2 hours, and then woke up, stood in his staged way, and walked to the door. I opened it. He went out into the corridor, which had 2 station techs in it, who had been waiting to provide refreshments, and who flattened against the corridor walls when Barley walked through, not because he was aggressive. He was not aggressive. He was navigating with the incurious efficiency of an animal that has lived in corridors for 8 years. But because he was large and solid, moving with the absolute conviction of something that has decided it is going somewhere and has no remaining interest in the room it left. I followed him out. The door closed. The session continued. I stood in the corridor with Barley, and he found a patch of floor near the wall that was warmer than the rest of it. There was a conduit run underneath. I'd noticed this before, and he lay down again, and I leaned against the wall above him and thought about what I'd watched. It took me a while to put language to it. I was 22, and I had not had enough sleep, and the protein bar was a long time ago, and the language for what I'd witnessed was not in my second-year curriculum. What I had watched was this: an organism that had spent 11 campaigns cataloging every weapon the compact fielded, every tactical approach, every trained unit, every piece of doctrine had encountered something it had not cataloged, and could not catalog in the way it cataloged weapons, because the category was wrong. The absorption index was built for things that were deployed at it. You could not build a counter-architecture for Barley, because Barley was not deployed at anything. Barley was lying on a warm floor because the floor was warm, and drinking from a bowl because he was thirsty, and looking at Vethrak-Suun because Vethrak-Suun was the large thing in the room, and Barley was, at some level below training or instruction or intention, the kind of organism that notices large things. And Vethrak-Suun had noticed Barley noticing him. That was the part that had produced the step back. Not fear in the way a threat produces fear. Something else, the recognition that the organism looking at you has taken your measure and not been impressed, and the recognition of that, not from a position of anything you can address or prepare for, but simply because it is true. Barley was not making a strategic calculation. Barley was telling the truth about what he saw, the way animals tell it, without diplomacy or tact, by the quality of their attention. He had looked at one of the most accomplished strategic analysts in the Vethrak-Suun hierarchy, the organism that personally overseen the nullification of 3 combined arms formations across 11 campaigns, and found him to be something that did not require a response. Vethrak-Suun was smart enough to know what that meant. I could hear my father saying, "The dog doesn't care about your credentials." Barley's ear twitched. He was dreaming something. I gave him the rest of the protein bar. The formal session concluded at 1700. Hollis came out of the door first, and she had the compressed, efficient expression of someone who has a great deal to do in the next several hours. She paused when she saw me. "You're Cadet Voss," she said. "Yes, ma'am?" She looked at Barley, who had woken up at the sound of the door and was in the process of standing. "He's 8 years old." "Yes, ma'am." "English Mastiff." "Yes, ma'am." She made a note on her tile. "You're going to need to provide a formal statement for the session record. Standard witness documentation. What you observed when from your position." "Yes, ma'am." "And Cadet." She paused with the particular expression of someone choosing words. "Carefully, the note in the record about Barley. That's formal diplomatic documentation now." "I understood that," I said. So did everyone else in that room. She looked at Barley one more time. "Take care of your dog," she said, and walked down the corridor. The debrief happened 3 days later. By that point, there were 17 people in the room who wanted to discuss what had happened, which was more people than had been in Assessment Hall 7 during the session itself, and most of them had opinions about causality, and what elements of the session had produced the pivot toward acceptance, and how to replicate those elements in subsequent contacts. I was not at the debrief. Cadets are not at debriefs generally, unless they did something that needs to be accounted for, and what I had done was stand against a wall and occasionally speak out of turn, which the station commander had apparently decided was incidental rather than actionable. I was told about the debrief afterward by Falk, who had been included because he'd organized the cadet detail, and was now technically a named witness in the formal record. He told me the debrief had run 4 hours and had been, in his words, very thorough. "They spent about 45 minutes on Barley," Falk said, specifically on the moment when Vethrak-Suun stepped back. "What was the conclusion?" I asked. Falk thought about this for a while. "The official conclusion," he said, "is that the encounter with a live Earth companion animal provided a recalibration opportunity for the Vethrak-Suun delegate, who had been operating with an incomplete classification of Earth's biological profile, and whose recognition of that gap prompted a reassessment of the strategic cost-benefit analysis underlying the rejection of the negotiating channel. That's the official conclusion." "Yes. What's the unofficial conclusion?" Falk was quiet for a moment. "Unofficial conclusion," he said, "is that Vethrak-Suun met something from Earth that didn't have a file, and it wasn't afraid of him, and he didn't know what to do with that." I thought about this. "He knew what to do with it," I said. "He sat down." Falk looked at me, metaphorically. "He literally took a step back and changed his upper limb configuration," I said. "I was watching. It was specific." Falk thought about this for another moment. "I'll include that in my section of the statement," he said. He also told me, the following day, that Kassath's formal species assessment had been included in the session documentation, and that intelligence had pulled it and cross-referenced it against the Vethrak-Suun's known biological classification architecture, and had come out with an interesting finding. The finding was, the Vethrak-Suun classification for apex fauna used 3 primary indicators: mass density, biome density origin, and what their taxonomy called the ambient pressure index, which was a measure of the psychological effect an organism produced on other apex class organisms in a shared space. High ambient pressure index meant the organism's presence actively altered the behavioral calculus of other apex fauna around it. Barley, cross-referenced against those indicators, scored high on all 3. "A mastiff," Falk said, with the careful expression of someone who has just done arithmetic and found the answer surprising even though the inputs were not. "He weighs 72 kilograms, I said. "He's 8 years old. He's from Earth." "All of that is in the report," Falk said. "The ambient pressure index," I said. "That's why Vethrak-Suun stepped back." Falk was quiet. "He didn't step back because Barley threatened him," I said. "He stepped back because Barley looked at him and had a low ambient pressure reading. That's the thing. A high ambient pressure organism meeting. Another high ambient pressure organism reads differently than a high ambient pressure organism meeting. Something that isn't generating any pressure at all. You can't match against something that doesn't put pressure on you. Feel the absence of your own. Falk looked at me for a moment. You should write that in your statement, he said. I did not write it in my statement. I wrote a plain account of what I had observed, in order, with timestamps where I had them. The statement was 6 pages. On the last page, I noted the upper limb configuration change and described it as precisely as I could. I did not interpret it. I left that for the people who were paid to interpret things. But I kept thinking about it. The formal negotiating channel opened 6 weeks later. The Compact's diplomatic team went into the first session with a full Earth companion fauna, taxonomy, as requested, and an annotated population density map covering all registered Compact stations and colonies. The Vethrak-Suun Strategic Board had reviewed it and requested clarification on 17 items, 12 of which were about dogs. I found out about this from Hollis, who sent me a brief note that said, "Thought you'd want to know." The clarification requests are attached. Note Item 7. Item 7 was a question about the behavioral profile of working breed dogs specifically, whether the calm displayed by companion Mastiffs in confined spaces with apex fauna was breed-specific or species-wide. The Vethrak-Suun wanted to know if it was a Mastiff trait, something particular to that lineage, or if it extended across the domestic dog classification. The answer, I provided in a 3-paragraph addendum to the official response, because Hollis asked me to, and I was apparently now a reference authority on. My own dog was species-wide. All dogs are from the Deathworld. The Mastiff just weighs more. Hollis sent back, that verbatim in the response. Attribution. Cadet 2nd Class T. Voss, Companion Handler, Vethrak Station. Vethrak-Suun's board can decide what to do with that. I did not know what to do with that either, but I appreciated it. The channel has been running for 11 months now. I am finishing my 2nd year, and I have another 2 years of posting rotations before I am anywhere near a specialization track, and the diplomatic corps is not where I am pointed, so the day-to-day of the negotiations is not my business, and I do not follow it in any official capacity. But the news comes through the station network, and I read it, the way you read something that you were, for approximately 40 minutes, standing next to when it started. The formal campaign cycles have been suspended. The Absorption Index has a new entry. Earth companion fauna. Classification status ongoing. Counter-architecture pending. The negotiating teams have met 4 times. 4th meeting 2 weeks ago produced a preliminary framework for mutual station access in the contested corridor regions. Not a treaty, not a resolution of underlying issues, but a thing that did not exist before, a place the conversation can go. Vethrak-Suun was in the room for the 4th meeting. He requested, through the cultural liaison, that the companion fauna taxonomy appendix be included in the formal documentation package. It was. He also requested, through the same channel, that a note be made in the session record, acknowledging that the ongoing dialogue had been materially advanced by a prior contact at Vethrak Station, in which an Earth Mastiff of 8 years had provided, in the cultural liaison's formal phrase, an unclassified calibration input that reframed the strategic assessment. The unclassified calibration input was named Barley, and he was turning 9 next month, and had no opinion on any of this. I got him a bone from the station commissary, which carries an Earth species veterinary package for personnel with animals on posting, and he spent the afternoon on the warm conduit patch in the corridor, outside my quarters, working through it, with the methodical patience of organism that has decided this thing is happening, and there is no hurry. A cadet from 4th year stopped in the corridor to look at him. She was new to Vethrak, and hadn't read the station's informal bulletin which someone had posted in the first week after the session, and which had since accumulated a very long chain of additions and citations, most of them from people who had done the calculation and come out the same way I had, which is, Earth produces a particular kind of organism, and that organism has been sleeping in human homes for 10,000 years, and the galaxy has been making assumptions about what that means that the galaxy has not examined carefully enough. What is that? The 4th year cadet said, meaning Barley. Mastiff, I said. 8 years old. Mine. She watched him working the bone. He's huge, yes. Is he friendly? Very, I said. Go ahead. She crouched down and held her hand out, and Barley, without interrupting his work on the bone, leaned his head over and pressed his nose into her palm. The slow wag started, unhurried, traveling the length of his tail. "He's wonderful," she said. "He is," I said. She stayed a while, and then she had somewhere to be, and she left. And I leaned against the wall, above Barley, and listened to him working through the rest of the bone. I thought about what instructor Veth-Marin had said in that seminar. The only variable they cannot absorb is a variable they haven't seen. They cannot counter something they haven't classified. I thought about the Absorption Index, and its 11 campaign entries, and its 1 pending item. I thought about a 2-meter organism with 4 upper limbs in apex display posture. The one who had nullified 3 combined arms formations, taking 1 careful step back from a dog who was choosing a nap location, and finding it satisfactory. The Deathworld, the briefing materials say, is characterized by elevated biological density, high adaptation pressure, and fauna that have evolved under conditions that produce, across the board, organisms more than the environment's baseline would predict. Earth is one of those planets. The Vethrak-Suun know this. They have always known it. Their files on Earth's apex fauna are extensive. Their files did not include Barley, because Barley was a pet. He finished the bone. He nosed the last fragment into position, worked through it, and then stood and shook and walked to the water bowl at the end of the corridor and drank comprehensively, and then came back to the warm patch and turned his circle and lay down. I scratched behind his ear. He sighed. Outside, 11 months into a negotiating channel toile that had taken 4 years and 11 campaigns to open, the galaxy was continuing to operate on the assumption that the interesting variables were the ones with files. The ones you could catalog. The ones you had seen before, in some recognizable form, and built a counter for. Barley was asleep before I stood up.